There is a particular kind of fire in these old stories that comes not from any god's forge and not from any stolen spark, but from an ordinary hearth in an ordinary house, a single burning log pulled from the flames by a mother's own hand the week her son was born, and hidden away for years against a day she prayed would never come. This is a story about that log, and about the woman it eventually destroyed, and about another woman, entirely unrelated to that fire, whose only crime, in the eyes of the men around her, was being better at their own contest than any of them. Tonight we follow two threads that the old poets wove into a single life: the hunt for a monstrous boar sent to punish an entire kingdom for one careless insult, and the footrace that came after it, in which the fastest woman in Greece was pursued not by any beast, but by suitors who could not bear to simply lose to her honestly. Both threads, in their own way, ask the same old and uncomfortable question: what happens to a world built entirely around men's pride, when a woman proves, in front of everyone, that she does not need their permission to be the best among them? To find the answer, we begin, as we so often must in these tales, with a king who forgot to say thank you. His name was Oeneus, and he ruled the kingdom of Calydon, a rich and fertile land, whose fields, that particular autumn, had given up a harvest so abundant that the granaries could scarcely hold it all. And Oeneus, like every king of that age, understood that such abundance was never truly his own doing, but a gift, and that the gods who governed the turning of the seasons expected, in return for their generosity, the simple and universal courtesy of thanks. So he gathered the first fruits of that harvest, and he offered sacrifice to every god of Olympus, whose favor had shaped his kingdom's fortune that year, to Zeus, and to Demeter of the grain, and to Dionysus of the vine, and to a dozen others besides, each one honored in careful and proper turn. But in the business of that long and crowded ceremony, in the sheer number of gods a prosperous king was expected to remember, Oeneus forgot one. He forgot Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the wild places, keeper of every untamed creature that still roamed the forest beyond his fields. Whether it was simple oversight, the old tellings do not fully agree, or whether some quiet and unconscious slight lay underneath it, a farming king's instinctive sense that a goddess of the wild had less claim on a harvest of plowed and cultivated land than the gods of grain and vine truly did. The result, either way, was the same. Artemis, who forgave slights against her own honor about as readily as her twin brother Apollo, forgave slights against his, noticed the empty altar where her own offering should have stood, and she was not inclined to let it pass quietly. Her revenge was not subtle, and it was not aimed only at the king who had wronged her. She sent down into the fields of Calydon a boar unlike any that had ever terrorized a Greek kingdom before, a beast of monstrous and unnatural size, its bristled hide as tough as iron plate, its tusks long as elephant tusks and sharp as forged blades, its eyes burning with a fury that seemed to carry, within it, the full and undiluted anger of the goddess who had sent it. This was no ordinary predator to be hunted at leisure by a handful of local men. It moved through Calydon's fields like a living catastrophe, trampling the ripened crops the king had only just finished celebrating, uprooting orchards that had stood for generations, goring farmers and their cattle alike, driving the terrified population of an entire prosperous kingdom to abandon their outlying farms and crowd for safety behind the walls of the city itself. It was a punishment perfectly calibrated to the crime. Oeneus had forgotten the goddess who governed the wild, and so the wild, unleashed and monstrous, came to remind him personally of exactly what he had forgotten to honor. No single hunter, and no single household of guards, could hope to bring down a creature of that scale. And so Meleager, the king's own son, a young man already renowned across Greece for his courage and his skill with a spear, did what any prince facing an impossible threat to his own kingdom might reasonably do. He sent out the call for help, and he sent it far and wide to every corner of the Greek world where a hero's name was known, inviting the greatest hunters of that entire golden age to gather at Calydon and join him in bringing down the beast together, with the promise that whoever finally landed the killing blow would win the boar's magnificent hide as a trophy for all the ages to remember. And they came. It reads, in the old tellings, almost like a second and smaller gathering of the same great company that would one day crew the Argo, Castor and Polydeuces, the twin sons of Zeus, Theseus, not yet king of Athens, still a young man making his own name, Jason himself, fresh from other adventures, Peleus, who would one day father the great Achilles, Nestor, still young, and not yet the wise old counselor he would become in his long old age, and a great host of other princes and champions besides, each one arriving at Calydon, eager for a share of the glory that killing so legendary a monster would surely bring. It was, by any measure, one of the most formidable gatherings of heroes that any single Greek myth ever assembled, outside of a war. And into the middle of that proud and crowded company walked one more hunter, and her arrival changed the shape of everything that followed. Her name was Atalanta, and she did not belong, by the ordinary customs of that world, among the company of princes and heroes gathering at Calydon at all. And the story of how she came to be there in the first place is worth pausing over, because it explains everything about the woman who would soon outshoot and outrun every man in that famous hunting party. She had been born a princess, but her father, wanting a son and receiving a daughter instead, had ordered the infant abandoned on a mountainside to die, exposed to the cold and the wild beasts, rather than raised as the heir he had wanted. But the wild beasts, in this particular story, proved kinder than her own father had been. A she-bear, sacred to Artemis, found the abandoned infant and suckled her alongside her own cubs, and Atalanta grew up wild among the animals of the forest, until hunters eventually found her and raised her properly among men, teaching her, since she had already survived what no ordinary infant should have survived, the skills of the hunt and the bow. And she grew into something the Greek world had genuinely never quite seen before. A woman as swift as any man alive, faster by far than most. A hunter whose aim with a bow rivaled the finest archers in all of Greece, and who had, by the time word of the Calydonian boar reached her, already proven herself in ways no one present could honestly dismiss. She had wrestled the great hero Peleus to the ground in open competition and won. She had been the first, by some tellings, to draw blood from the terrible boar of Erymanthus, that Heracles himself would later be sent to hunt. She came to Calydon not as a curiosity, and not as a favor to anyone, but as one of the most accomplished hunters then living in the whole of Greece, entirely capable of standing, by right of skill alone, beside any prince in that gathered company. And her presence, the moment she arrived, split the assembled heroes cleanly in two. Some of the older and prouder men among them refused, flatly, to hunt alongside a woman at all, muttering that her presence among them was an insult to the whole ancient dignity of the chase, that, whatever her skill, a woman simply had no place standing shoulder to shoulder with men in a contest of this kind, regardless of what her bow could or could not do. It is worth sitting with the particular shape of that objection for a moment, because it says everything about the world Atalanta was moving through, and almost nothing at all about Atalanta herself. No one present, in any of the old tellings, seriously questioned whether she could shoot straight. They questioned, instead, whether a woman ought to be allowed to try, as though the danger she posed to their pride mattered more in that moment than the very real danger the monstrous boar posed to their kingdom. But Meleager, the young prince who had called this whole company together in the first place, had, by this point, already fallen deeply and completely in love with her, and he insisted, over every grumbling objection, that Atalanta hunt among them as an equal, with an equal claim to whatever glory the hunt might bring. It was, in its own quiet way, as brave a stand as anything that followed with a spear in hand. A prince, host to the greatest heroes of his age, choosing to risk the wounded pride of powerful men rather than turn away a hunter, whose only real offense was being better than several of them expected a woman to be. The hunt itself, when it finally began, unfolded exactly as badly as an assembly of proud, competitive, and mutually resentful heroes, chasing a single monstrous prize, might be expected to unfold. The great boar, when they finally roused it from the thicket where it had been terrorizing the countryside, proved every bit as devastating as its reputation had promised. It gored two of the assembled heroes to death before a single meaningful wound had been landed against it, tearing through spear thrusts that would have felled any ordinary suit, its iron-tough hide turning aside blade after desperate blade. Panic and confusion spread through the hunting party as quickly as the boar itself moved. Heroes scattering and regrouping, and scattering again, several of them, in the chaos of the charge, nearly striking down their own companions by accident in the wild confusion of thrown spears and startled retreat. It was, for the first long stretch of that famous hunt, less a triumph in the making than a genuine and bloody catastrophe, the pride of Greece's finest hero proving considerably less useful against a monster sent by an angry goddess than any of them had assumed it would be. And it was Atalanta, in the middle of that chaos, who drew first blood. Standing her ground while others scattered, she loosed an arrow from her bow that struck true, sinking into the great beast's flank behind the ear. The first wound of the entire hunt to actually draw blood from a hide that had turned aside every blade thrown against it so far. It did not kill the boar outright. That would take the combined efforts of several more heroes working together before the beast finally went down. But it was the wound that broke the creature's invincibility. The proof, offered in front of the very men who had grumbled that she had no business being there at all, that a woman's arrow could do what a dozen princes' spears, thrown in panic and confusion, had so far failed to do. Meleager, fighting at her side, drove the final and killing blow home himself soon after, ending the beast's rampage for good. But he did not forget, in the moment of victory, exactly whose arrow had drawn first blood, and exactly whose courage had held steady, while so many of his fellow princes had scattered in confused disarray. And so, when the boar at last lay dead, and the exhausted hunters gathered around the enormous carcass to divide whatever glory and spoils the kill deserved, Meleager did something that the proudest men present found almost impossible to accept. He claimed the boar's hide as his own by right of the killing blow. And then, in front of the entire gathered company, he gave it away, presenting the magnificent trophy to Atalanta instead, declaring publicly that the honor of first blood belonged to her, and that she more than any man present, had earned the prize. It is worth pausing here, before the story turns dark, to notice exactly what Meleager did and did not do. He did not simply admire Atalanta from a respectful distance, the way a lesser story might have led him. He used his own authority, his own standing as the prince who had called this hunt together, to force an unwilling company of proud men to publicly acknowledge a truth several of them had spent the entire hunt trying to deny, that skill, in the end, does not care about the sex of the hand that wields it, and that a woman's arrow, loosed with a steady nerve, while braver-seeming men panicked and scattered, had done more to end the terror of Calydon than most of the spears thrown that day. It should have been, and for one brief and shining moment, it was a genuinely happy ending, a monster slain, a kingdom saved, a deserving hunter finally and publicly honored for exactly what she had done, in front of the very men who had doubted she belonged there at all. But pride, wounded and made to swallow a truth it does not want to accept, has a way in these old stories of curdling very quickly into something far uglier, and this particular wound would not stay quiet for long. Among the assembled hunters were Meleager's own uncles, his mother's brothers, proud men who had never fully reconciled themselves to being outshone by a woman in the first place, and who found the public gift of the boar's hide to Atalanta an insult they simply could not swallow in silence. They confronted their own nephew, telling him bluntly that the trophy belonged to family, to blood, and that it was an outrage for a prince to hand so great a prize to a foreign huntress over the claims of his own kinsmen who had also fought and bled in that same hunt. And when Meleager, standing by his gift and by the woman he loved, refused to take it back, his uncles simply seized the hide from Atalanta by force, unwilling to let a woman's honor stand in the way of what they considered their own rightful family claim. What followed happened, the old poets tell us, in a single instant of blind and unthinking fury. Meleager, seeing the prize he had publicly and rightfully awarded torn away from the woman he loved by his own kin, struck out in rage, and in that single, terrible moment, he killed his own uncles, his mother's own brothers, with his own hand. And here the story reaches back, quietly and terribly, to that ordinary hearth we began with, and to the log a mother pulled from her own fire the week her son was born. For Meleager's mother, Althea, had received, in the days just after his birth, a visit from the three fates themselves, the ancient goddesses who weave and measure, and finally cut the thread of every mortal life. And they had told her a strange and specific prophecy, that her infant son would live exactly as long as a particular log, then, burning on the household hearth, remained unburned. Althea, hearing this, had rushed to the fire and snatched the log from the flames with her own hands, smothering the last of its burning edge, and hidden it away in a locked chest, guarded jealously for years, so that her son's life might never be shortened by the simple accident of an ordinary fire finishing what it had already begun, the night he was born. For years, that hidden log had kept her son safely, invisibly alive, a mother's love, quite literally holding death itself at bay in a locked chest in her own house. But when word reached her that her own son had killed her own brothers, blood of her blood cut down by the child she had once saved from the fire with her own hands, something in Althea broke in a way that no love, however deep, could hold back any longer. Torn between the two most fundamental loyalties a woman of that world could hold: loyalty to the son she had carried and raised, and loyalty to the brothers she had grown up beside her whole life, she chose, in the end, her brothers and her grief and her fury. She took the hidden log from its locked chest, where it had lain safe for so many years, and she placed it back upon the fire, and she watched it burn. Far away, at that same hour, Meleager, who had done nothing since the killing but grieve for what his own rage had made him do, felt a sudden and inexplicable burning take hold of him, an agony spreading through his whole body, with no visible wound to explain it, and he collapsed, and within the space of that log finishing its burning down to ash, he died, killed, in the end, not by any boar, and not by any enemy's blade, but by the very fire his own mother had once saved him from, brought back by that same mother's grieving hand, to finish what it had been fated to do since the very night of his birth. And Althea, seeing what her own hand had done, understanding too late and too completely the full weight of the choice she had made, could not live with what she had become, and took her own life soon after, so that a single afternoon's confrontation over a boar's hide ended, by its final reckoning, not merely in 3 deaths, but in the utter unraveling of an entire royal house, uncles, son, and mother all gone, undone by a chain of events that had begun, with nothing more than a wounded pride, refusing to accept that a woman had, quite simply, hunted better than they had that day. It is worth sitting with the full shape of that ending before we follow Atalanta onward into the second half of her own story, because it tells us plainly, and without any softening, exactly what this particular myth believes about the wages of wounded male pride. Every single death that followed the boar hunt, the uncles, Meleager, Althea, traces back to the same single avoidable moment. Grown men, proud hunters, and princes among them, unable to bear watching a woman receive an honor she had genuinely and visibly earned, choosing violence over simply accepting the truth in front of them. Atalanta herself, notice, did nothing at all to cause any of it. She shot the arrow that drew first blood. She was given, fairly and rightfully, a trophy for it. Everything that followed was entirely the doing of men who could not accept that outcome gracefully, and the story does not let them escape the consequences of that failure lightly. It is one of the darkest and most pointed morals in the whole of Greek myth, and it is easy, hearing the tale told quickly, to let the tragedy of the burning log overshadow the much simpler truth sitting underneath it. An entire royal family destroyed itself, in the end, because it could not bear to let a woman win. Atalanta went on from Calydon with her reputation only grown larger, her name now spoken across Greece not merely as a curiosity, but as one of the genuinely great hunters of that entire heroic age. And in time, as such reputations always eventually do, it drew the attention of a father who had never wanted her in the first place. For her own father, the very king who had ordered her abandoned on a mountainside as an infant to die, hearing of the famous and celebrated huntress his lost daughter had become, sought her out at last and welcomed her home, eager now, in his old age, to claim as his heir the very child he had once been so willing to discard. And with that homecoming came, as it so often did for a woman of royal blood in that world, the sudden and unwelcome pressure of marriage. For a king wanted his daughter properly wed and settled, whatever adventures she might have had in her own free years as a wandering huntress. But Atalanta, whether from a warning she had once received from an oracle that marriage would bring her ruin, or simply from a hard-won love of her own independence that she had no wish to surrender to any husband's household, had no interest whatsoever in being married off to whichever ambitious prince happened to ask for her hand. And so she devised a contest, one final trial of her own choosing, that she was quietly and entirely confident no suitor would ever actually manage to win. She would race any man who wished to marry her on a straight and measured track, and any suitor who could actually outrun her fairly, with no trick and no shortcut, could have her hand exactly as he wished. But any suitor who lost the race, and Atalanta, remember, was among the fastest runners, male or female, that Greece had ever produced, would pay for that failure with his life, cut down by the spear she carried with her to every race. Precisely so that idle or unserious suitors would think very carefully before wasting her time. It was, in its own way, exactly the same message Meleager's uncles had refused to accept at Calydon, stated now in even starker and more literal terms. Here is a woman who is simply, factually faster than you, and if your pride cannot bear the thought of losing to her honestly, then do not bother trying at all. And for a long while, that grim condition worked exactly as she intended. Suitor after eager suitor lined up at the starting mark, certain in the easy overconfidence of young men who had never once had to seriously consider that a woman might simply outrun them, that this particular race would surely be the one exception to Atalanta's long and undefeated record, and one after another they lost, and one after another, true to the terms they themselves had agreed to. They paid the price the story had set. It should, by any reasonable measure, have discouraged every further suitor from ever trying again. It did not quite, because pride, as this whole story has already shown us once, rarely learns from the deaths of other proud men nearly as quickly as it ought to. Among the suitors who eventually presented himself was a young man named Hippomenes, or, in some of the older tellings, Melanion, who watched the race unfold from the sidelines before ever daring to enter it himself, and who, watching Atalanta run, found himself falling in love with her, not despite her speed and her fierce independence, but precisely because of it, an entirely different reaction from every suitor who had come before him, each of whom had approached the contest as a challenge to be conquered, rather than a woman to be genuinely admired. And understanding, with a clearer head than most of his rivals, had managed that he could never hope to beat her. Through speed alone, Hippomenes did what so many of the cleverest figures in these old myths eventually learned to do when raw strength alone will not serve. He asked for help. He prayed to Aphrodite, goddess of love, who, perhaps moved by the young man's genuine devotion, or perhaps simply amused by the chance to complicate a huntress's long streak of victories, gave him 3 golden apples, magical fruit of extraordinary and irresistible beauty, and a single piece of instruction to go with them. Drop them, one at a time, during the race itself, whenever he most needed to slow his rival down. And so the race began, exactly as every race before it had begun, with Hippomenes falling quickly behind the swifter and more practiced huntress, exactly as every doomed suitor before him had fallen behind. But as Atalanta drew ahead, Hippomenes rolled the first golden apple across her path, and Atalanta, whose fierce independence had never once been reported in any of the old tellings, as immunity to simple human curiosity and desire, could not resist pausing to scoop up so beautiful and strange an object, costing herself, in that brief and understandable detour, several precious strides of her lead. He gained ground. She caught up again, drawing ahead a second time, and he rolled the second apple, further off the direct line this time, forcing her further from the straight and fastest path to retrieve it. And again she paused, and again he gained. And as the finish line drew close, and Atalanta once more began pulling steadily ahead of him, Hippomenes threw the third and final apple not directly in her path this time, but wide, off to the side entirely, so that catching it would cost her the most time of all three, and Atalanta, whether from simple habit by now, or from a growing curiosity about a man and clever enough to keep finding new tricks to slow her, went for it anyway. And in that final costly detour, Hippomenes crossed the finish line first, by the narrowest of margins, and won, fairly by the letter of the contest's own rules, if not entirely by its original spirit, the right to marry her. It is worth pausing on what this ending does, and does not say about Atalanta herself, because it would be easy to hear the story told quickly and conclude that she was simply outwitted, bested, last by a cleverer man. Exactly as her uncle's generation had always insisted a woman eventually must be. But notice what actually happened in that race. Hippomenes never once beat her through speed. He beat her by understanding correctly that raw physical competition was a contest he could never win against her honestly, and by finding, instead, a genuinely creative solution that worked with her nature rather than against it, appealing to a simple human curiosity that had nothing whatsoever to do with weakness. And Atalanta herself, by most of the old tellings, appears to have gone on to love him freely and completely once they were wed, which suggests, reading between the lines the old poets left for us, that perhaps she had grown weary of racing away suitor after doomed suitor, and had been waiting all along, less for a man who could outrun her than for one clever and devoted enough to give her a genuine reason to want to slow down. Their marriage, though, did not end in the quiet peace such a clever and hard-won courtship might have earned them. In their happiness, the old tellings say, Hippomenes forgot to properly thank Aphrodite for the gift of the golden apples that had won him his bride, and the goddess, no more forgiving of an overlooked debt of gratitude than Artemis had been at the very start of this whole long story, caused the two of them, in a fit of uncontrollable passion, to violate the sanctity of a sacred temple grove, an act of disrespect for which the offended god of that shrine transformed them both, on the spot, into lions, a fitting and strangely tender punishment in its own dark way, for the goddess ensured that lions, according to the old belief, could mate only with leopards and never with their own kind, so that Atalanta and Hippomenes, even in their transformed and bestial state, remained bound to one another forever, unable to ever truly be parted, running now side by side through the wild places she had always loved best, exactly as she had run alone through those same forests as an abandoned child raised by a she-bear so many years before. And so we return, at the very end, to the question this whole long story was quietly built around. What happens to a world built on men's pride when a woman proves, honestly and repeatedly, that she does not need anyone's permission to be the best among them? The story gives us two very different answers, laid side by side so that we cannot help but notice the difference. At Calydon, the answer was catastrophe, an entire royal family destroyed because proud men could not bear to watch her win fairly and simply let her keep what she had earned. In the footrace, the answer was something far gentler and far rarer in these old tales. A man who did not try to beat her pride down, but who found through patience and cleverness and a willingness to work with who she actually was, rather than who he wished she would be, a way to win her heart without ever once needing to diminish her. Atalanta never once, across the whole of her story, became less than what she was. Not the fastest woman in Greece, not the huntress who drew first blood from an unstoppable monster, not the daughter a father once tried to leave for dead on a mountainside, and later came crawling back to claim. The men around her changed across the story, far more than she ever did, some destroyed by their own inability to accept her. One, in the end, elevated by his willingness to finally meet her exactly where she stood. Rest now. Let the old forests settle back into their quiet, where somewhere still, the story tells us, two lions run together beneath the trees, bound forever to one another, exactly as they chose to be, exactly as she was always fast enough and always free enough to have chosen for herself all along.